Si confiara en la televisión, no te pudiera conocer. Porque en ella nunca pude ver a la llaman Ramunangue bailar. Le agradezco tanto a mi pueblo por resistir. Con el cumaco de su pecho y su agitado latir. Doloroso a tus amores y a un poco de violín. Sudor de los trabajadores, de obrero cultural que no parará. Y tan subestimado está este canto, disque pa' amenizar. Con el cocuy y unos ramazos lo vamos a estimar, pa' que aprendan a respetar. ¡Vamos pues! ¡Marcha velo! Si ya andas cansado de remodelar, entonces vente a destruir. Ya se agotará ese reformismo y vamos a construir. Hay que aclarar bien el camino para acabar la confusión. Esa etiqueta conformista no es lo que aspiro yo, no es lo que aspiramos, no. La alborada guiando esta canción, intentando calmar las penas de hoy, la de mi gente, de su rabia y su clamor, señalando a los traidores del amor. Apunta creador la idea con la acción. No lo vas a ver, no lo vas a ver. La alborada guiando esta canción. La alborada guiando esta canción. La alborada guiando esta canción. La canción. La alborada guiando esta canción.
Welcome to CODEPINK Congress. I'm Marcy Winograd, and with me tonight co-hosting is Michelle Ellner. She's one of our Latin American coordinators. So thrilled to be with Michelle and with her father as well, who's coming up later on in the show. Steve Ellner, he'll be talking about leaning left with Latin America, what's going on with the pink tide there, and Leonardo, who's another one of our Latin America coordinators at CODEPINK. He will also be giving us a survey of the terrain, the political terrain in Latin America. But first, I want to introduce my co-host, Michelle Ellner, who will then turn it back to me, and we will meet Daniel Manacao, who's here with us tonight. We're very honored to have him. He is a Cuban diplomat at the embassy in DC, in Washington, D.C. But first, Michelle. Michelle was born in Venezuela. She holds a bachelor's degree. Excuse me, if you could mute yourself, please. She holds a bachelor's degree in languages and international affairs from the Sorbonne in Paris. After graduating, she worked for an international scholarship program out of the offices in Caracas and Paris, and was sent to Haiti and to Cuba and other countries for the purpose of evaluating and selecting applicants. Later, she worked with community-based programs to promote productive endeavors in Venezuela, and then served as an analyst of U.S.-Venezuela relations. Michelle, how did you connect with CODEPINK?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting story because, in 2019, the U.S. Recognized Juan Guaido like the president of Venezuela. And so I was working at the embassy with my wonderful colleague, Leonardo Flores also. And then the US was starting to seize diplomatic buildings and giving them to Guaido. So I met Medea, and she had this wonderful idea, Medea Benjamin from CODEPINK, of sleeping at the embassy in order to protect the embassy from being seized and given them to Guaido. So that was such a brilliant idea, and then started the Embassy Protection Collective, which with all these amazing activists that came and slept in the embassy, and we had talks, and we made so much connections, and so that led me to CODEPINK, and with my wonderful team and coworkers, and I am so grateful and lucky to be in this team.
And we are lucky to have you. Michelle is an incredible talent. I don't know if you've seen any of the videos. Well, you just saw one of the videos that she produced with the music from Venezuela. All right, let's go to our first guest. But first, before we go to our first guest, I just want to back up and say, in light of what's going on, it's so important that you stay with us till the end, when we are going to jump on the phone and send emails to the White House, the State Department, call our Congress members to co-sponsor bills that call for lifting the blockade, for opening up trade with Cuba. And we'll hear why that's so important. Of course, a lot of you know why it's so important. I am pleased to announce that the chair of the House Rules Committee, Jim McGovern, who was one of our guests on CODEPINK Congress earlier, he wrote a letter to the Biden administration urging the administration to lift the sanctions on Cuba. We know another 200 were added under Trump, strangling sanctions. In addition, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, has echoed that call. So we just have to keep up the volume. All right, we are now going to go to our first guest. Daniel Menachal is the third secretary at the Cuban Embassy to the United States in Washington, D.C. Before that, Daniel Menachal worked at the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the U.S. General Division, that was from 2015 to 2018. He has a degree in international relations from Cuba's High Institute of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Daniel Menachal.
Hello, how are you, Marcy?
Great, and we're just so pleased to have you, and it's obviously very timely and important that we hear what's going on from you.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to start by thanking you for the invitation, and also by thanking the solidarity that CODEPINK has offered to Cuba in recent times. Once said that, I would like to talk about the events that took place in Cuba last Sunday, which were a direct result of the situation the country is living, which combines the economic crisis, the scarcity, the food and energy shortages, and the effects of the COVID pandemic. All these problems generate upset in the Cuban population, as them would do it in any other country living the same. But no other nation has had to deal with 60 years old blockade imposed by the most powerful country in the world. The effects of the blockade has been catastrophic for the Cuban people, as it deepens the economic crisis, increases the scarcity of elemental products like food or medicines, and makes harder the fight against COVID-19. At the end of Trump's administration, more than 240 measures were taken to reinforce that same blockade in the midst of the worldwide pandemic, and those measures were designed to generate hunger, power shortages, and discontent in the Cuban population. The direct result of this criminal US policy against Cuba were the protests that happened last Sunday. Protests that were manipulated from the United States when the traditional anti-Cuban right wing were, and still is, running a media campaign to create a sensation of disturbance and instability inside the country using fake news and thousands of bot accounts on social networks. The protest started in the San Antonio de los Baños municipality, as a peaceful demonstration of people upset with the country's difficult situation, and where the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, went there, walked down the streets, met with the protester, and talked about the issues they were raising, something that is extremely hard to see in any other country. But this situation was the perfect starting point to the second side of the right-wing campaign against Cuba. And it was the mobilization of their paid agents inside the country who took the legitimate discontent of the population to first take some people out to the streets to demonstrate, second, change the protest argument from scarcity and crisis to regime change, third, try to turn those protests into violent manifestations, and finally ask for a, quote, humanitarian intervention. And here I would like to specify something. You have to be very mean or very naive to ask for an intervention against your own country. A country whose government you could agree or not, but where you were born and where part of your family still lives in. Mostly when it's well known what have happened in the countries that have been humanitarily intervened in the past. Getting back to what happened in Cuba, the outcome of that plan was the situation most of you have followed during this day. But the agitation didn't count with the fast reaction of the Cuban authorities. The revolutionary people who responded to the call of the president took their streets to defend their country, to defend their system, to defend their revolution. Right now, the situation is calm, but there are still a few people trying to replicate what happened on Sunday to keep the media and social network campaign running. Only that this time, there are just a few opportunistic and violent people trying to earn some of the $20 million the United States government approved for the regime change programs in Cuba. Once said that, I would like to talk about COVID-19 situation in Cuba, which is experiencing a peak on the cases related with the outbreak of the Delta variants of the virus in the country. Just today, Cuba has almost 37,000 confirmed cases and 1,600 people have died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. These numbers are very sad because our country has managed to keep much lower figures since the beginning of the pandemic, but they are still way better than the numbers you can see in other countries in Latin America, Africa, or even in the United States itself. But this situation is not being left aside by the Cuban authorities. Our country continued to develop our 5 vaccine candidates, 100% Cuban, one of which was authorized as an effective vaccine with more than 90% of efficiency against the virus. The massive vaccination process is ongoing in Cuba. And on July 11th, only 2 days ago, Cuba had vaccinated almost 2 out of the 11 million people who lived in the country, and a total of 7.5 million doses of our vaccines has been administered to the population. As you may see, the Cuban government, regardless of all difficulties imposed by the blockade, keeps fighting the pandemic and expect to have the whole population vaccinated by the end of this year. Finally, I would like to make a call for solidarity. These are difficult times, and difficult times demand people to help each other. This global pandemic will only be defeated if everyone works together beyond particular interests. Blockades and coercive measures are not the answers. Solidarity and cooperation are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And at this point, I'm going to ask people to post questions in the chat. We usually wait for all of our speakers to present and then do a Q&A, but because we have almost 2 shows in one, and this is our time to look at Cuba and talk about expressing solidarity, we're going to open it up to questions at this point. Daniel, for those who say, well, Cuba could go somewhere else, you know, we're imposing a blockade, yes, it's 60 years now, yes, but why can't Cuba get syringes from other countries? So perhaps you can explain that.
Yes, I mean, most of it is part of the blockade, because when you mention blockade, people usually don't know the depth of what we are talking about. For instance, the United States at the beginning of the pandemic blocked a shipment coming from China with precisely pulmonary respirators. I mean, the equipment people need to get alive during when dealing when they are in the critical condition because of COVID-19. This is part of the blockade. Cuba cannot buy most of the products who have more than 10% of the United States components itself to anyone, to any country. So to buy complex medicines or medical equipment, even in third countries, is very difficult because some of them, or most of them, have more than 10% of US components. So Cuba is not allowed to buy that. Also is the monetary issue. When you have in international commerce, when you are going to do a transaction in United States dollars, that transaction passes through the United States monetary system, financial system. And they feel free to blockade all Cuba's transactions only because they are related to Cuba. There's no issue, there's no point in for what is the transaction. If the product or the service, if just has to do with Cuba, it's blockable by the United States. And they enforce that seriously, but also penalize banks and financial institutions that have deals with Cuba. And the result of that has been the fines they have imposed against a lot of banks in Switzerland, France, Canada, other countries, not in the United States, because we don't have normal banking relations just because of the blockade. And it's something that we would like to have, but it hasn't been possible. So this is just a general picture about everything that some of the things that compose that blockade, which is much bigger and general.
Thank you, Daniel. I don't think most people realize the steep fines and the punishment for any kind of executive violating U.S. sanctions. They can go to prison for 20 years.
It can come from a $10,000 fine to someone who travels to Cuba to make tourism, which is forbidden for the United States citizens, to $3,000 million to a bank who had relations with Cuba.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, well, we saw this at CODEPINK. We opened this GoFundMe campaign to raise money to buy the syringes, and it was immediately blocked just by containing the words Cuba, although we had all the licensing and all the requirements from the Department of Treasury. And it's amazing, like all the time that it takes and money for paying for lawyers. I mean, it's incredible. People don't realize this, but it's what Cubans are suffering every day. So we have a question here from Joe. How have the United States policy against Cuba changed or not changed since Biden became president?
So far, the Biden administration announced they have the policy against Cuba under review. They are reviewing the policy. They even have mentioned some areas they are reviewing particularly, like remittances or travel or the reopening of the American consulate in Havana, but nothing of that process have come to light so far. So they still keep saying that the policy is under review, but they haven't said when it's going to be a result of that review. So in the practical issues, Cuba is still under the Trump's presidency measures. I mean, all the 240 measures Trump take are still in force. And that hasn't changed and won't change until the Biden administration announces anything else.
So absolutely. And again, I remind everyone, please stay till the end. We're going to be sending messages to our Congress members and to the White House to lift this blockade. To be cynical or to be realistic, a lot of it apparently is coming down to Florida, and not just the presidential race in 2024, but the Senate race. The Democrats don't want to lose control of the Senate. They're hoping that they can defeat Marco Rubio, one of the senators from Florida, with Val Demings. Meanwhile, people are suffering. It's horrible. Daniel, some may be surprised that there is a Cuban embassy in DC. Perhaps you can tell us what the status of this embassy is, whether it also operated under Trump, or what's your day-to-day job like?
Actually, yes, we have a running embassy in DC. During the government of Donald Trump, we have seen our staff reduced by the 60%. So when they closed their consulate office in Havana, I mean, they reduced their staff there, alleging some attacks or kind of story they use for that. and they force us to do the same. So in a way of reciprocity, if they remove 60% of their personnel, we have to remove 60% of ours. So with 40% of the people who is supposed to be working here, we have to do the 100% of the job. So you can imagine it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And we are here, we are working to build bridges to bring our countries closer, and trying to engage. I mean, to demonstrate we can have better relations than what we have now.
Thank you. Michelle?
Sorry, yeah, I have a question. So yeah, we heard this thousands of people protesting the economic conditions and all that. Were there counter protests in support of the government? We know that on the 26th of July, it's a very important date for the revolution. How many people typically turn out for rallies in support of the revolution?
I mean, in the whole country, and on select dates like May 1st, 26th of July, before the COVID pandemic, of course, we had millions of people on the street. What happens on Sunday, there were thousands of people who demonstrate in the street, but we also had thousands of revolutionary people who were in the streets also to defend their revolutions. And all what revolution means, because you can see as a government or in abstract, but revolutions mean free healthcare, means free education, it means opportunities for everyone. So that happened on Sunday. It was clearly the majority of the people who live in Cuba supports this government, this system, and all that has to do with it. And it's even when we recognize the right to everyone to express themselves, it's very important to do it peaceful, because violence is what shut down the communication. So that's a very important thing to have into account. But what we was shown, even when the media, particularly here in the United States, and the social network campaigns tried to hide, even tried to use the revolutionary demonstrations and masquerade them as counter-revolutionary demonstrations, the people took the streets and were able to calm down the situation. So today I can say it's mostly calm.
That's good to hear. Daniel, somebody asked in the chat, what do you think about the possibility of China's SWIFT system as an alternative to US sanctions? I guess moving to a different monetary system or exchange system?
Sure. Actually, it's something I don't know very well. I had to study about it to make comments. But the reality is that for Cuba, which is in the Caribbean, it's very difficult or more difficult to get products in China or in Asia, because it is more expensive. It takes more time to come. It's not that easy. And Cuba, as a sovereign country, has the sovereign right to trade with any country we want. So why we cannot buy products in, let's say, Canada or Jamaica or Brazil or Chile? Because they are in US dollars. So why one country has the possibility to block the transactions made in the currency which is used to buy the things in the international market? So it's not something which I mean it's common sense. If most of the international trade it is in US dollar, it's important to us to have the ability to use it. So it's something elemental.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, Michelle. You have a question? Otherwise, I'll ask a question.
There's a question on the chat. Is Mexico still trading with Cuba?
Sure, I cannot specify what goods or services are we trading, but yes, Mexico is one of the most important Cuban commercial partners, and it has been for a long time because it's very close to Cuba, so it's common sense to be that way.
Well, actually, I have one more question.
Don't worry, don't worry.
Leo posted in the chat. Can you talk a bit more about the Cuban vaccines? Will Cuba share that intellectual property with the global South so that they can produce vaccines as well?
So about the vaccines, I know Cuba has 5 vaccine candidates. One of them, which is the Abdala vaccine, was already authorized to be used as a vaccine. It has a 92% efficiency against the COVID, so which are very good news because it's in the top 5 of worldwide vaccines. Cuba has 2 100% Cuban. One is Abdala, which is already authorized, and the other one is Soberana, that is in the final stages before the authorization. But in the case of the Cuban vaccine, we have always said we are able to share our product. I mean, we're not going to do the same thing that other countries who uses all vaccine for themselves and not share it. So we are able to share that. In the case of the intellectual property, I understand there is something going on in that way in the World Commerce Organization. So it's a thing I'm not very sure about, but you can count that we have the disposition to share our vaccines with the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daniel Menacau, Cuban diplomat stationed at the embassy in DC, the Cuban embassy. And at this point, I just want to second Daniel's call to express solidarity with the Cuban people, to get on the phone with your member of Congress. And Mary, if you can, post the link where people can find out exactly the staffer they should approach. We also have it at the CODEPINK website under the toolkit. You can track legislation and you can contact the foreign policy staffer. So please do that. Set up a relationship, develop a relationship with that staffer and talk to them about lifting the embargo and what is your representative doing. So at this point,
Marcy,
Michelle?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say for folks who are in DC or nearby, on July 25th, we are having a rally, a welcome rally for Cuban American Miami to DC walkers that are calling for an end to US blockade on Cuba. Carlos Lasso, who is a Cuban American school teacher and Iraq war veteran, is leading this march, and we are having a rally there. There's going to be a caravan, and there's going to be an event at Busboy and Poet. So please go to codepink.org/Cuba 07/25/2021.
Oh, let me write that down. Hold on. Codepink.org. Yeah.
I will post it in the chat right now. So please go to this website and check out the event. And if you are near, please come and join us.
Yes. And hopefully the money that we raised for the syringes, I think CODEPINK raised something like $400,000. Those syringes will be arriving soon, if not tomorrow in Cuba.
May I say something?
Yes.
Yes. Nesbitt Crutchfield, Bay Area Vincent Ramos Brigade, National Vincent Ramos Brigade. I just wanted to, I'm not sure how much time I should take to say this, but I've heard more about Cuba and Haiti in the last 2 or 3 days than I've heard in the last 3 years. And most of it has been not very supportive of Cuba. But one of the things that we're trying to do in the Bay Area is that we're going to have a car caravan on the 25th of July to celebrate this brother's arrival in DC. And we're going to be selling, trying to raise money for the syringe campaign. And also we're going to be trying to do some political education around what this means and the reality of what's going on there. And so I just wanted to say that I think it's really important that we make it very, very clear to those people who have questions that this is the United States way of trying to suffocate Cuba. And Cuban people are people like everybody else in the world, and they're hungry and they're complaining about that. But they must lift the blockade and they must remove those 273 sanctions that Trump put in.
Absolutely.
And I just think.
Yes, Nesbitt, if you can put your contact information in the chat, people may want to talk to you about organizing something like that in their own community. And thank you for that. Appreciate you sharing that with us. We're going to turn now to our next guest, and Michelle knows him well.
Yeah, so right now we're going to talk to Leonardo Flores. He is my colleague and friend. He was born in Venezuela. He used to be a senior policy analyst at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., and he worked as an analyst at the Ministry of Urban Agriculture in Venezuela. He currently serves as a Latin American campaign coordinator at CODEPINK. Leo recently returned from Venezuela, where he attended the Bicentennial Congress of the People, which is a global summit of political parties, figures, social movements, and academics. Leo has also visited Ecuador and Bolivia this past year to observe the elections. And he works constantly with the Cuba Nobel Campaign and ACERE, which is the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. He is a member of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Sao Paulo Forum and a Globetrotter People's Dispatch Fellow. So Leonardo, can you give us a general overview of the left in Latin America, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to be a little short because up next we actually have the guy who wrote the book. I don't know if you can see that. Latin America's Pink Tide by Steve Ellner. Oh, there we go. That's better. So we have the guy who wrote the book on the Pink Tide coming up. So I'll cede to the expert. But basically, you know, the Pink Tide was this period in the early 2000s when you had left government after left government take power throughout Latin America. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Evo in Bolivia, Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, and her spouse before that. So you had all these left governments and all these social movements really begin to take power in Latin America. And I think the first kind of challenge for this Pink Tide was defeating what's known as the Free Trade Area Agreement of the Americas, the FTAA. These left movements, these left parties in power came together with social movements throughout the region to defeat this proposal to create the Western Hemisphere into one huge free trade area, which would have, you know, devastated local economies in favor of multinational corporations. Since then, the left has seen some serious setbacks in the region, really kind of starting with 2013 with the death of Hugo Chavez. But right now we're in a moment where, you know, Latin America is a region where there's a lot of kind of agitation going on. You have all these mass social movements, you have left political parties that are colliding against neoliberalism, against local oligarchies, and against US empire. So there's a really huge potential for the rise of a new pink tide. And this kind of rise of the new pink tide starts really kind of, we always had Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela remain firmly in the camp of the left. But then in 2019, you saw Argentina, you have Alberto Fernandez. He defeated the conservative / neoliberal president, Mauricio Macri. Fernandez might actually be kind of the most centrist member of this new pink tide, but he's also given very important support to Bolivia, to Venezuela, and just yesterday to Cuba, he made very strong statements demanding an end to the blockade on Cuba. Also, we have in Bolivia, you know, Bolivia lived through a right-wing coup in 2019, as many of CODEPINK's followers know, because Medea Benjamin went down to Bolivia right after the coup. I was there myself in 2020 to observe the elections. And really the story about Bolivia in 2019, 2020 was how mobilizations, how social movements, how organized people's power took the country back, because they went out onto the streets en masse in July and August of 2020. They forced this coup regime, super right-wing coup regime, to set new elections. The coup regime had been postponing elections time after time in an effort to stay in power, but they paralyzed the country, forced new elections, and then the elections were won by the Socialist MAS Party. And the MAS Party really kind of learned their lesson from the coup and started working more closely with the social movements that put them in power in the first place. In Mexico, we also have another, you know, example of the pink tide. We have AMLO. He won historic elections under Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He suffered a slight setback in legislative elections earlier this year when they kind of failed to take a supermajority in the legislature, but they still have a plurality. It's still a really important social movement behind them, a political party behind them called Morena. And they were also, Mexico has maintained this really important position of non-intervention, which has been kind of crucial, particularly for Venezuela, because it was assumed that, you know, before AMLO came into power, the previous president would have supported Juan Guaido. And so now with Mexico supporting the legitimate president of Venezuela, that took a lot of pressure off the country. In Peru, we have these historic elections. Medina Benjamin was just there. And you have this candidate who seemingly came out of nowhere because nobody really knew who he was before the primaries. And, even when he won in the primaries, which I think were in April, the news stations didn't have a picture of him. So they just had this kind of blank portrait with the guy who was winning the elections in the primaries. And that's Pedro Castillo, of course. He ran under the slogan, "No more poor people in a rich country." And it looks like he's actually going to finally be inaugurated on July 28th. The loser of those elections had been challenging the electoral results really without any proof. And the electoral authorities were kind of trying to drag it out. But now it looks like the votes have finally been counted in full, and Castillo is set to take office. Peru is going to be a country to watch because I think there's a very serious threat of a coup in Peru. You have oligarchic elements, including renowned author Mario Vargas Llosa openly calling for a coup. But behind that, or rather, in contrast to that, in opposition to that, you have, he won the elections with huge. Millions of voters are behind him. Millions of people really believe that Peru can change. They're calling for a new constitution in Peru. And a new constitution is what's going to also happen in Chile, right? So since 2019, 2020, Chile saw some very, very, violently repressed protests where people were protesting against neoliberalism. And then, the Chilean people rose up and they demanded a new constitution. They got a vote for a new referendum on a new constitution. The yes vote won, meaning that there's going to be a new constitution. And then there was a constituent elections to select members of the Constituent Congress or Constituent Assembly. And again, there you have various leftist alliances that won a majority. And the right wing was so defeated that they were unable to take even a third of the seats in the Constituent Congress, and that is important because that means they no longer have veto power. So Chile's constitution, which dates back to a dictatorship, basically, is finally going to be changed. It's finally going to hopefully become a people's constitution. And Chile also has elections coming up November 2021 and primary elections this weekend. And the interesting fact there is that the Communist Party leader, Daniel Jadwe, is leading in the polls. And speaking of someone else leading in the polls, Brazil, you have former President Lula da Silva. He's up by over 25 points and he's winning, basically. He would win in the first round of elections if they were held today, but those are actually going to be held in October 2022. So there's still a long way off, but still very important hopes for the left. There's been mass protests over the past months against Bolsonaro, who has really done such a terrible job of containing the pandemic, that Brazil has been hit so hard by the pandemic. And people, aren't having it anymore. And in fact, there's actually corruption investigations into Bolsonaro. It's really a big mess, but I think Lula his chances are really, really good for those elections. Colombia, I think that's the last country I'll talk about, and then I'll cede it over to Steve. Colombia just lived through 2 months of a national strike and protests where 74 people were killed and another 500 people were disappeared. There was brutal repression by the Colombian armed forces and police. But really what these protests demonstrates are a total dissatisfaction of the Colombian people with the government of Iván Duque and more broadly with neoliberalism. I mean, I think that's kind of the key in almost every country I've been talking about is neoliberalism, this rising up against neoliberalism, this idea that, public services should be privatized, that the state should be made as small as possible, that the social safety net should be cut as much as possible, that education and health shouldn't be free. And people really want, obviously, education and health and other basic human rights, and they're fighting for that. And I think that's really what's driving this new resurgence of the pink tide. In Colombia, elections are next year. And again, you have a left-wing leader, Gustavo Petro, who's leading the polls. So I think the scenario for the left looks really good in Latin America. We had a big setback in Ecuador where the left lost. Mostly it lost because of issues of lawfare, but looking more deeply, it also lost because the political party there, the left party led by Andrés Arauz, really had kind of lost its connection to the social movements and the base which had spurred the citizens' revolution in the first place. So that'll be key to see this interaction between political parties and social movements and how closely they work together. And I think that's going to be a determining factor for the left in the next few years.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Leo. I mean, you went through everything in such a short time. I mean, you did it great. So Thank you so much. And now we're going to, well, this is a very special program for me because I get to introduce one of my favorite people in the world, my dad. So let's welcome Steve Ellner. He is a retired professor that has taught economic history and political science at the Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela. He's an author and an editor of numerous books, including Latin American Extractivism, Populism in Latin America, and Latin American Pink Tide, Breakthroughs and Shortcomings. So Dad, or Steve, what was the importance of the first pink tide and what will its reinsurgence mean?
Well, okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Marcy. It's really great to participate in this this webinar and to talk about a topic which is dear to my heart, namely the state of the Latin American left. And Leonardo did an excellent job in explaining the first point that I was going to make. And that is that I would argue that the position of the Latin American left at this moment, I'm talking about July 13th, 2021, the situation may change next week. But at this particular moment, and in spite of the fact that the situation in Cuba is worrisome, I would argue that the position of the Latin American left has never been this bright. There has been a comeback, which Leonardo did a very good job in going into detail to explain the different parties in the different countries that were elected. Pink-tide governments were elected, beginning with Chavez in 1998. And then there was a right-wing pushback, beginning with the election of Mauricio Macri in November of 2015. But now the left is coming back. And I think the important point to make is that when there was this right-wing pushback, when the left was getting defeated in a string of defeats, one after another, in Argentina, in Venezuela with the elections for the National Assembly, and it looked like the pink tide was now out of the picture. The so-called experts, beginning with Jorge Castillo, the professional anti-leftist, right? You know, the situation in Latin America is like a pendulum. It goes back and forth, first the left and the right, and nothing really changes. And that's not really the case. The left left a legacy, and the only way to explain the left's comeback, beginning with, as Leonardo mentioned, the election of López Obrador in Mexico in July of 2018, the only way to explain the left's comeback is precisely to understand the legacy and to understand that the left's experience in power was not at all like the experience of the right in power. Beginning with the fact that many of the leftist candidates for president won elections, were reelected several times, and they received very high percentage of the votes. Morales got 64% of the votes in the 2009 presidential election. Chavez got 63% in 2006. So that's one fundamental difference. And the other legacy that I think has to be mentioned is that there was a sense of Latin American unity. Leonardo made reference to that. Organizations that were created that are still around. ALBA, taking in the more leftist or progressive governments. CELAC, which still is in existence here in Mexico. I'm in Mexico right now, and CELAC, López Obrador is trying to revitalize CELAC. Petrocaribe. So there was a sense of unity that the leftist presidents promoted, even though there were differences between Chavez and Lula. Lula was much more moderate than Chavez, but nevertheless, there was a sense of unity among those different governments. And the other point that has to be made is that even though all countries, all governments, even neoliberal ones, in the case of the progressive governments, in the case of the pink tide, they prioritized social programs and created a sense of empowerment and participation among the marginalized sectors of the population. That's very important because those marginalized sectors of the population represented the social base for those pink-tide governments. And thirdly, there was a progressive foreign policy of all the pink-tide governments. They all supported the reincorporation of Cuba in the community of Latin American nations. Lula recognized the state of Palestine. He got a lot of flack from Washington for that in 2010, and then other pink-tide countries followed suit. So that this legacy has to be taken into consideration. The other reason why I am upbeat about the situation with the left in Latin America, said that the situation has never been as promising as it is now. And that's extremely important because just like we're talking about a wave, the pink-tide wave beginning with Chavez's election, and then the right-wing pushback, which was somewhat of a wave also. And now there's a counter wave, the pink-tide governments, the progressive governments returning to power. There was a wave of anti-neoliberal protests in late 2019 in Chile, Ecuador against the neoliberal policies of that government, in Colombia, in Honduras beginning in the spring of 2019, edited those neoliberal governments and demonstrated their repressive character. And then also another factor which explains my optimism, and that is you have a polarization in Latin America. And in that polarization, the pink-tide, the progressives against the right, it's not a polarization. The centrists have been kind of knocked off the table. And so you have a situation in which progressives are facing right-wingers, not concentrists, who have a certain amount of legitimacy, but the rightists, as you know, we see in the case of Brazil with Bolsonaro, Duque in Colombia, Piñera in Chile, Juan Orlando Hernández in Honduras, and those rightists, even though they have a certain amount of support, though not much, in the case of Bolsonaro, that has really whittled away. He had a 30% backing after the honeymoon effect, but now it's way below 20%. In this case of Duque and Piñera, not to mention Hernández in Honduras. But in addition to the fact that they have a much smaller backing than they had when they were first elected president, they have a much bigger rejection rate. I mean, you see that in the case of Trump in the United States, that the people who don't like Trump, they hate him. And the same thing can be said about Bolsonaro, Duque, Piñera, and Hernández in the case of Honduras. And then the other thing that I would like to mention is that the social movements that are protesting these neoliberal governments are consolidating themselves. Leonardo mentioned this to a certain extent in the case of Chile, but it's happening also in the case of Brazil, in which the social movements which were on the streets protesting neoliberal policies beginning in 2019, and they're still doing that in the case of Colombia, there's support among those social movement organizations which traditionally have sometimes been apolitical and have refrained from supporting or backing or endorsing presidential candidates. They're backing the leftist candidate in the case of Chile, as Leonardo mentioned, and the case of Brazil with Lula. So the last point that I want to make, and I'm not sure whether this is positive or negative, but one generalization we can make is that this new pink-tide generation, if you want to call it that, beginning with López Obrador, is more moderate. They have a greater sense of pragmatism. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but what's good about it is that sense of pragmatism is based on self-criticism. The pink-tide, in addition to achieving a lot, the pink-tide left us with a very rich experience. And it's important for us, people on the left, progressives, and especially people in those respective countries, to analyze those experiences. There were successes, but there were also shortcomings. And I think that one of the experiences and one of the reflections on the left is that you had a commodity boom in the first decade of the 21st century. And then things changed, especially after 2008, things changed. There was a contraction. And the left in power really wasn't prepared for that situation. There's kind of a looming assumption that the prices of oil, of gas, and other commodities, soya, for instance, in the case of Brazil and Argentina, that those prices were going to maintain themselves at higher level. And that's not really the case. History demonstrates that those prices tend to sharply fluctuate. They go up, but then they plummet. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve Ellner, Michelle's father, for that tremendous analysis. We're going to take about 5 minutes right now for some questions for both Leo Flores and Steve Ellner about leaning left in Latin America. I'll start out and then perhaps you can post in the chat. Michelle will ask as well. So my question is, to what degree do you think the United States is seriously considering going into Cuba or Haiti? To what degree is this a threat? And I would think that that would be one of our demands right now. US, stay out of Cuba, stay out of Haiti. Leo and then Steve.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. would intervene in Cuba. I think that's a kind of a position taken by extremist right wingers, and the position is being made not so much because it's a realistic possibility, but if it's an argument being used to derail any possibility of a rapprochement, like we saw with Obama and Cuba during the last couple of years of Obama's term in office. So it's certainly an argument that we have to reject, and certainly we have to keep pushing for an end to the embargo and for normalization with Cuba. Regarding Haiti, I really hope that, I mean, I think that's where a lot of our organizing efforts have to be put into, and to ensure that there is no US intervention in Haiti. Haiti is a country that's been intervened militarily for almost all of its history since it became free, and it's really still being punished for being the first country to be free in this hemisphere, and really the first modern democracy in the world. And already we've seen the Biden administration say that they are not considering a military intervention into Haiti at this time, but that's the key phrase, right? At this time, we have to make sure that there's no military intervention at all in Haiti. And in fact, I'm going to interview Dr. Jemima Pierre of the Black Alliance for Peace for CODEPINK Radio. We'll put the link in the chat in a second, but that'll be on Thursday. And she's got a very interesting analysis of Haiti. So I urge you all to tune into that.
Thank you. Anything you want to add, Steve?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I agree with Leonardo in the case of Cuba, but in the case of Haiti, it is worrisome. And I think one of the points that has to be raised is that in the United States, many moderate progressives, for lack of a better term, in Latin America, the term is center-left, but whatever word you want to use, liberal, what have you, that the going discourse is that these progressive governments have committed a lot of errors. Some of them are bad guys, actually, but we're opposed to intervention. And I think that what those people are missing is that when they criticize specific policies, and I also criticize specific policies, but in the right context, I don't talk about it all the time, but in my articles, if you want to look it up, you'll see that I'm critical of Maduro in Venezuela, which is the country that I write most about. But that has to be linked to the war in Venezuela. And I don't talk about the sanctions only. I use the term the war on Venezuela. You can use the same term for Cuba. And so if you divorce the two, if you say these are fallacious policies and these are undemocratic governments, and then there's also the sanctions, which we oppose, you're really missing the point, because those policies that you're criticizing are related or the results of the war in Venezuela and the war on Cuba. I would say that in the case of Haiti, I'm not particularly optimistic. I think that, Biden, given his, long history of support for interventionism, that's a definite possibility, especially given the fact that the president, one of the presidents of Haiti, is actually calling for U.S. Intervention. And I just want to say one other thing, Marcy, and that is I was listening to an interview with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Democracy Now! And I was really struck by the fact that she said that she was in opposition to intervention in Haiti. She was asked that question. And then she said, especially because there's no plan. In other words, the implication was, if Biden was to present a plan, then the intervention may be justified. And I think that's a dangerous position, because I think that progressives in the United States and everybody in the United States has to look at the record of US intervention. If you don't want to go back too far, well, just talk about post-World War II history with Guatemala, with Iran, with Chile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. You could almost say that the United States hasn't won one in terms of the possible cases in which the US intervened and there might have been a more favorable outcome. So that I think that the position has to be no to US interventionism under any circumstances.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Michelle, if you want to ask that question, then we're going to move on to our capital calling, emailing party. I urge everybody to stay with us. We want to lift the embargo and we want people to hear our message in Congress and at the White House. Michelle?
Yeah, so my question is, do you, or for any of you, Leo and Steve, do you consider that Russia and China are important allies for progressive governments in Latin America? And if so, in what sense?
I'll go first then, Steve. Allies might be a very strong word for some of these governments, but certainly they're important partners. And I think one of the big differences between, say, the United States and China is the way they engage with these countries. So with China, there's really an understanding and really a respect for the principle of sovereignty. I don't think when we see China making trade deals with countries, there aren't conditions attached to regarding what they have to do within their own country in order to get aid or in order to get a big massive trade deal. And we see that constantly with the United States. We also see constant electoral interference from the United States. China doesn't do that. Russia doesn't do that. And I think that's one of the things that marks the biggest difference. So it's not necessarily that, that there's a natural tendency from these progressive governments to go towards Russia or towards China. But the reality is that the United States rejects many of these governments in the first place and actively works to counter them. And so the United States isn't seen as a reliable partner in any sense of the word.
Thank you. Anything you want to add, Steve?
Sure, I agree 100% with Leo with regard to the issue of sovereignty, both politically and economically, in terms of just the fact that China and Russia have, very clear positions with regard to Latin America and with regard to Africa and other places in the world as well. But specifically Latin America, their position is we respect the sovereignty of each country. This has been the position of China going back to the 1950s. And you don't have this. The Biden administration is reactivating the Cold War and all the jargon and the discourse that's associated with that. But the fact of the matter is that China is not promoting alliances. Perhaps during the Cold War you had that on both sides, but China doesn't have alliances like the United States has in Asia and Europe and elsewhere. They're not promoting a group of organizations that are pro Beijing. And in addition to that, on the economic front, Chinese capital, Chinese investments, especially investments from the state sector, from the Bank of China, which is state-run, those investments are with no strings attached. So I think that those distinctions have to be made. Comparing Chinese investments with IMF investments, and comparing China's discourse on foreign policy as well as its actions on foreign policy with that of Washington.
Thank you very much, Steve Ellner, Leo Flores, our guests tonight, along with Daniel Menocao, on lifting this horrible embargo on Cuba that's really strangling the country in the midst of a pandemic. Talk about inhumane and cruel, and a look at the left, the rising left, the ascendant left in Latin America. Please stay with us. We're going to now put on the screen. Oh, first, let's unmute and thank our guests. Can you do that? Okay, everybody's still muted, but I see hands clapping. Good. All right, so at this point, we're going to post in the chat and on the screen our capital calling emailing party script. And we hope that you will share this script with friends and allies, your social media networks, because we want to amplify our message. And basically our message tonight is to our members of Congress, join Gregory Meeks, Chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, join Jim McGovern, Chair of the House Rules Committee. Those are two incredibly powerful positions, and echo the call to lift the embargo on Cuba. And we'll send that message to the White House as well and to the State Department. So there's the link for tonight's action, but also if we can post it, Mary Sana, on the screen, that would be really helpful. While they're doing that, however, you should have, if you don't already, in your phone, the number for your representative in Congress and your senators. So if you don't have it, now would be a good time to put it in your phone. And we're going to call them right now while they're putting that up on the screen. So you have two paragraphs here, one for your House representative, one for your senator, basically saying the same thing, the same message, except different bills, obviously, because the bills in the Senate, there are two, there's one in the House that would lift the embargo. And then once you're done with that, please email the Biden administration and you can send the same message there.